began 2 or 3 weeks ago, a couple weeks ago, we started a series on Sunday mornings called Life is Meaningful. It's coming from the book of Ecclesiastes. And the book of Ecclesiastes was written by a guy by the name of Solomon, who happened to be a king. And he was pretty much the wisest, wealthiest, most influential man on earth. He had it all going for him by the world's standards. But in spite of having everything that this world had to offer, there was something missing. He was still unsettled at some point in his life. Even a godly guy, at some point kind of hits a funk, and he just was not really settled. He's trying to figure out the meaning of life and make sense of it. I think sometimes, everybody kind of goes through that, and maybe he had a midlife crisis later in life, and just trying to make, sense of it as we come to grips with our own mortality, maybe. I'm not sure what was going on in Solomon's mind. But because he is wise and wealthy and influential, he had the resources and the ability and the capacity to kind of try and figure out how to have a meaningful life through a lot of different avenues. And so each week we're kind of looking at one of those different things, because I think that there are, different ones of us, we kind of gravitate to one of these more than others. And last week we looked at kind of intellectualism and wisdom and knowledge, that sometimes people think they can just kind of reason their way into making sense out of life, and it's all about just being smarter and smarter and smarter, and we certainly want to be wise, but sometimes, sometimes even we can't get out of our own way. Our own intellect is the very thing that causes people sometimes to rationalize away God, for that matter. And he found, in spite of all that wisdom, it's better to be wise than to be dumb. It's better to have wisdom than just folly, he says, but he says, but wisdom in and of itself isn't enough. And so when that path, it says he devoted himself to it. But when that path didn't work, he went to the other extreme, like people do sometimes, and figured, well, I'm just not going to think about anything. I'm just going to do everything. And so it's really just a passionate pursuit of pleasure. And he said, I've been, working so hard and thinking so much, and that's not working. I might as well just enjoy life. It just became a colossal pursuit of happiness. And I think it's interesting because Solomon kind of like a lot of people believe that maybe, the key in life, the most important thing we can do is figure out what makes you happy and do that. Is the highest question for a lot of people is, well, what will make me most happy? A number of years ago, there was a guy, philosopher by the name of Epicurus, about 2,300 years ago. He's a Greek philosopher, and he came up with an approach that's similar to that called hedonism, if you've heard that word before. Hedonism, which is pretty much just about the pursuit of happiness. And at one point he said this, he said, we must pursue the things that make for happiness. Seeing that when happiness is present, we have everything. But when it is absent, we do everything to possess it. So he would say everything is really just about making sure that you're happy. And the reality is that we have a God who wants us to be happy. How many of you want your children to be happy? If so, Scripture says if we, being evil, know how to give good gifts to our kids, and we essentially want them to be happy, how much more so our Heavenly Father would want those things for us. And so we have a God that's not trying to make life miserable on us, contrary to what some people in the world might think. He actually loves us deeply, and he wants us to be happy. That being said, is that there is more to life than just being happy. In fact, a recent study revealed something I thought was interesting. Only 29% of Americans describe themselves as being very happy. Only 29% of Americans describe themselves as being very happy. And the reason for that, a lot of different things. Well, life has its share of challenges and trials. And so when life is hard, sometimes happiness goes out the window because our happiness is dependent upon circumstances. Does that make sense? And so in order to be happy, we always have to create circumstances that are compatible with us being happy. And the reality is if you found that it's not always easy to do that, everything in life is not always happy. So the other part of it is that sometimes we think, I'd be happy if I just had this or this happen in my life. And because that never comes, we're never really happy or satisfied. Or when it does come, we're not satisfied and happy for very long. You ever watch kids, like at Christmas, and they get all these gifts, and they're so excited with them for about 2 weeks. And then they're bored, and they're ready for the next toy. And sometimes it's just, we think something will make us happy, and then we get there and we find that, that doesn't make us as happy as we thought it would, and so we're never really happy or satisfied. The other problem with happiness, with everything being all about happiness, sometimes what would make us happy may not make somebody else happy. Does that make sense? So if it's really about is just me being happy, and people go through life like many people do these days, saying it's really about what makes me happy, then that means ultimately, even if it's at the expense of somebody else, that doesn't matter as much as me being happy. I'll give you one example of that is just, in marriages, at some point, somebody reaches a point in their marriage where they decide that somebody else might make them more happy. And so, the families are destroyed and marriages are destroyed and families and kids are destroyed because somebody says, what's most important is that I'm happy. And I'm sorry that makes you unhappy, but ultimately it's most important. I'm the one who has to live with me, and so as long as I'm happy. Does that make sense? So it feeds selfishness and self-absorption on some level. And so is that really the key in life is just as long as I'm happy, even if it's at the expense of anybody else's happiness, as long as I'm happy. And we live in a world, whether you go to counselors or pull up things online or our friends or peers that will tell us, do whatever makes you happy. That's really what's most important. And so I'm not sure that that's ultimately, even though personal happiness is of great value, but is that really the key to life? Well, if anybody could speak to that question, it's Solomon, because he tried all kinds of things that he thought would make him happy. And that's what I'm going to look at today. Because as we go through this, you might find, I thought that would make me happy, or sometimes, we think maybe not happy, but happier. And not to say that some of these things won't bring pleasure on some level, but sometimes it's not as, it doesn't leave us as happy as we thought it would. So if you have your Bibles, I'm going to invite you to stand with me in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verses 1 to 11. So he says, I said to myself, self, come now, I will test you with pleasure to find out what is good. But that also proved to be meaningless. Laughter, I said, is madness, and what does pleasure accomplish? I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly, my mind still guiding me with wisdom. I wanted to see what was good for people to do under the heavens during the few days of their lives. I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. My heart took delight in all my labor, and this was the reward for all my toil. Yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless. Chasing after the wind, nothing was gained under the sun. Thanks, have a seat. It's a really fascinating section of Scripture, and it's so honest. And the verse that really struck me a lot, and I underlined it, he said, I denied myself nothing my eyes desired. I refused my heart no pleasure. Most of us are things we desire but we can't have. If Solomon, anything he wanted, he could have. As king, he could demand it, and he certainly had the resources to be able to pay for everything. It's crazy to think about having so much money that it's like you can do whatever you want, or so much power and influence. And that was Solomon. And we live in this kind of culture, I believe, that tells you don't refuse yourself anything that you desire. Is don't withhold anything from yourself that you desire. If you feel something, if you want something, if you're drawn to something, by all means, you need to do that. Because the worst thing in life is to suppress what you want. And they say, well, that would make you miserable if you just suppress what you want. And so we're encouraged essentially, rather than God sitting on the throne of our life, we sit on the throne of our life. And it's no longer about what would make God happy. It's about, what will make me happy? And that drives us. And I want to look at some of the specific things, because maybe we can identify with these things. And as Solomon said, I tried this, I tried that. And And even though there may have been some happiness or pleasure associated with it, I can tell you that if that's really what life is all about, that's not what life is about. And I call these things happy myths. Happy myths, which is hard to say. But they're things, not to say that these things won't make us happy, but they sometimes, don't make us as happy, and they don't bring us meaning like we think they would. And so the first thing Solomon identifies is, some people say, well, I'll be happy when I'm having a good time. I'll be happy when I'm having a good time. Life is all about the next good time. It's the next party. It's the next whatever's happening. It's really I just want to have a good time. He says, laughter, I said, is madness. And what does pleasure accomplish? How many of you like to laugh? I like to laugh. And it's not always predictable. Sometimes I'll just get going. And the other day we were making those dad packs, Amy and I, and we hit a part where I messed up on something, and for whatever reason, it just struck me funny, and I couldn't stop laughing, and I was crying, and she said, what is wrong with you? And I just couldn't. You ever have those moments? And on some level, it's goofy and everything, but it feels really good. It's just, I love to laugh. And after all, I actually think that laughter has merit. We need to laugh. They found that people are healthier if they laugh more. The saying, laughter is good medicine, right? And even Solomon, in chapter 3, he says, there is a time to laugh. And so laughing and good times are good. But at the same time, kind of what he found is that after you're done laughing and after the good time is over, some of the problems in our life are still there waiting for us. It doesn't necessarily fix everything. It's sometimes an escape from everything a little bit. I remember years ago, Cyndi Lauper sang that song, Girls Just Want to Have Fun. And I think some people, that's kind of their theme song, is I just want to have fun. So they go through life, pursuing what will be fun or what they think will, be a good time. But Solomon, had the capacity to have a really good time every day, every night. It was just, for a while, I'm just going to have good time after good time. I don't have to work. I don't have to do anything. You ever been that way? Like, man, if I don't have to work and everything, and he could just have good times and laugh, and that wasn't enough. What's been interesting is in recent years to see some incredibly funny people who are incredibly sad on the inside. It's been interesting to watch, high-profile people that are incredibly funny on the outside, but inside are incredibly unhappy. I came across an article this week, and the title was this: Happy and funny are not the same thing. Isn't that good? Happy and funny are not the same thing. And in it, the article is basically the story of 30 high-profile funny people or comedians that were incredibly funny but not very happy. Some of the people, I didn't list all 30, but some of them include Robin Williams, Jim Carrey, Chris Farley, Sarah Silverman, Woody Allen, Drew Carey, Rodney Dangerfield, Ellen DeGeneres, David Letterman, Conan O'Brien, Owen Wilson. All these are funny people who have said that they suffered from extreme depression in their life. A lot of times people wouldn't know it because they seem so happy on the outside. Chris Farley, go and put the next slide up there. I don't know if you know who that is, but he used to be on Saturday Night Live. And he eventually overdosed on drugs. And he said this. He said, when the roar of laughter dies down, the silence is a terrifying sound. It's quite a statement. And everybody laughing and everything, but when it dies down, it's like the silence is terrifying. Robin Williams, who committed suicide. I grew up watching Mork and Mindy and everything, and it's just hilarious. But he said, I think the saddest people always try the hardest to make people happy because they know what it's like to feel absolutely worthless, and they don't want anyone else to feel like that. It's quite a statement, isn't it? It's just on the outside, everything looks so good. I remember there's a song called Tears of a Clown. Originally it was done by Smokey Robinson, and a number of years later was re-released. And the idea of just a clown that, puts on a mask and looks happy, but inside, is incredibly sad. And just part of the lyrics, of that song, Tears of a Clown, says, now if there's a smile on my face, it's only there trying to fool the public. But don't let my glad expression give you the wrong impression. Really, I'm sad. Oh, I'm sadder than sad. And everything, can look, really funny and happy on the outside, but incredibly painful on the inside. Solomon even talked about this in Proverbs chapter 14. He said, even in laughter, the heart may ache. Even in laughter, the heart may ache. So good times are good, and laughing is good medicine and fun and everything, but at the same time, it doesn't necessarily cause all of our problems to go away. It doesn't fix everything. Kind of in a similar vein is the next thing. Solomon says, like others, I'll be happy when I'm incoherent. I'll be happy when I'm incoherent. He says in verse 3, I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly. I tried cheering myself with wine and embracing folly. And by the way, folly means to act like a fool, and a lot of times that goes hand in hand. Being drunk and acting like a fool tend to go hand in hand. It's interesting, I don't know if you know this, but nearly 14 million Americans meet the criteria for alcohol use disorders. 14 million Americans meet the criteria for alcohol use disorder. And it's become elevated, as you watch people post things, and it's just everybody with a bottle of, a glass of wine, and we live in an area that, and I'm not knocking the wine industry in and of itself, but there's this sense of just, I'm happy when I have a glass in my hand, and I wonder how much of, alcohol is really the desire to be happy or the desire to escape unhappiness. Does that make sense? Is it really desire to be happy, or is it trying to escape something? My wife's dad died of alcoholism from cirrhosis of the liver. Created all kinds of pains and problems, and often not very happy or settled in his life. And Solomon, he said, for a while, I just got drunk a lot. I just drank and I drank and I drank. But, ultimately, that didn't solve all his problems. You wake up and all your problems are there for you, and probably a few more that came up during that time as well. Create problems for ourselves, problems for other people as well. Third thing, sometimes people say, I'll be happy when I'm in my dream house, when I'm in my dream home, if I just had the right house. In verse 4, he says, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself. Not just house, but houses. And he built houses for all of his concubines as well, but he built incredible houses. For some people, it's just if I could just have a house with a little more room and a better place or something like that, then I'd be happy. It's interesting. It took Solomon's builders 7 years to build the temple for God. It took them 7 years, 100,000 workers to build it. 7 years, that's a long time. And they didn't have, it's not because it was held up, in the building commission or something like that. It was just a lot of stuff. It's interesting? You know how long it took Solomon to build his house? 13 years. Give you an idea of how big his house was, right? 13 years to build his house. I built not just a house, but a mansion. We live by Hearst Castle, and I did the tour there. Our family went through there not too long ago. And it's interesting. It was just always wanting to buy something new to have somewhere from all over. It was just an obsession to find more stuff to bring in. And if you've ever been there, it is never quite enough. It's constantly turning things over, just building and building and buying and buying and buying, and never, he said, I did that, and it never really satisfied. Some people say this, well, I'll be happy when I'm surrounded by beauty, when I'm in my happy place, or I'm living in my happy place, not just my happy house, but my happy location. It's interesting, and because it's really interesting, if you've ever been to Bakersfield, they do a really good job of helping you forget that you're in the valley. It's really interesting. We live there, and you drive along, and you got a lot of trees and green and all kinds of stuff like that, and it's 150 degrees. It's just, but it looks. They just made it look good. You ever been to Palm Springs? Hotter than snot out there, and it's just boiling hot. But the golf courses and everything around there is like, ooh, this is a beautiful place. And so it's just interesting. Solomon, even back in those days, is interesting what he says. He said, I built houses for myself, planted vineyards, I made gardens and parks, and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water grows or flourishing trees. So he said, I built a planned community, essentially. And it had amazing gardens and parks, and then I built these reservoirs that, back in that day, it was pretty incredible, that he'd find a way to get water to all that as well. And so it's easy sometimes. Some people say, if I just don't like where I live, or if I could just
be in my happy place and live somewhere else, I'd be happy. Or if I just am always in my happy place, then things would be okay. Solomon had all that, and he still didn't make him happy. How about the next one? Somebody say, I'll be happy when I can take it easy. That one sounds pretty good. When I don't have to work, when I don't have to do chores, when I don't have to do anything, I would just be happy if I didn't have so much on my to-do list this week. I feel this way, every once in a while, you may say, we really need to do the backyard and pull some weeds, and I don't want to do that. I work during the, I'd just be so happy if I didn't have to do stuff. So Solomon's solution, verse 7, I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. He said, I'll just find people who can do everything. Solomon didn't have to do anything himself that he didn't want to. He had somebody who could do literally everything for him. It's estimated actually that Solomon had over 10,000 servants. Think of like everybody in Morro Bay being available to serve you. It's just, they're all there for you. That's what Solomon had going for him. Think about this, think of everything you wish you'd have to do each week. You'd have a chef to cook your meals, a hairstylist or beautician or a fashion consultant. So you always had the best clothes and you looked amazing. Someone to take care of your pets or even better, clean up after your pets. Someone to watch your kids anytime you wanted to take a break. Personal physician available at all times. You don't have to go to a doctor's office. They just come to you. Your own personal landscaper, personal house cleaner, maybe a fix-it person. You don't have to change a light bulb or anything. For everything you want, you have personal assistants. So I said, man, that would be the life. Solomon had that life. He said it still didn't make him happy. It still didn't satisfy. Next one. Some people say, I'll be happy when I'm financially secure. I'll be happy when I'm financially secure. Either that I'm out of debt or that I have some savings. Solomon says, I amassed silver and gold for myself and the treasure of kings and provinces. It's interesting, I was looking this up. Do you know that including mortgage, other loans, and credit cards, the average American household has a debt total of $100,915. Over $100,000, over $101,000 in debt. Plus, have you noticed inflation? Things cost more than they used to. Gas, it's just, you're like, yeah, I found gas for $4 today. What a bargain, and, years ago, not that long ago, you'd say, man, $4 is out of control, and I don't know if it's ever going back. I go to the grocery store and bread, $4 for a loaf of bread? Seriously? It's just, you can't get out of the grocery store without spending, a few $100s these days. And so we think if I just didn't have debt or if I just had enough money, then everything would be okay. It's interesting. Last year, did you know that food prices in 1 year increased by 11%? Probably doesn't surprise you. We go somewhere and everything costs more. It's interesting. Solomon, I shared this a couple weeks ago, but Solomon, he annually earned, the gold that he earned every year just from taxes alone, $1.5 billion a year. He had $1.5 billion a year coming in. You make professional athletes looking like they're in poverty. And that's in addition to the gold and exotic treasures that people brought him from all over the world. The dude was filthy rich. But even that didn't make him happy. And you see this sometimes, people that have a lot, but they, at the same time, really don't have the things that matter most. They're empty on the inside. Next one. Some people say, well, I'll be happy when I'm entertained. I'll be happy when I'm entertained. He says, I acquired male and female singers. So back in those days, they didn't have televisions. They didn't have, Apple TV. You couldn't just stream things. You couldn't watch things on your phone or your computer. And they didn't have, you couldn't just, there weren't iPods and digital music and everything else available to them. They didn't have Spotify. So if they wanted those things, it had to be live, which is kind of cool, but not always easy. It was live entertainment, You think about medieval times, they had jokers to kind of entertain them as well. And he says, so I basically brought in, think of your favorite musician, your favorite group.
And recently, Taylor Swift, man, her stuff went on sale, and it's just cost so much and went so fast. And people, I'll have Taylor Swift come over and entertain me. You can have anybody, anything you want, come and just entertain you. And Solomon had all that all the time, and he still wasn't all that happy. It didn't really satisfy. Next one. I'll go ahead and I'll be happy when I'm in a relationship or having lots of sex. Yeah, I said that in church. I'll be happy when I'm in a relationship or having lots of sex. It's interesting, Saul, and there's a lot of people that's really, sex is on their mind all the time. And it's fleshed out in a lot of different ways. And so it's interesting in his case, he said, I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. Some people, and I get this, think if I just had a boyfriend or a girlfriend, if I was just married, I had somebody to share my life with, then I'd be happy. I just can't stand being alone. And I get that, and I'm sympathetic to that. I understand that. And we think that's what I need, but then sometimes even with that, there come challenges and things like that. But it's contingent upon having somebody else. I have a theory about why God didn't create Adam and Eve at the same time. Because he's God, he knew he was going to, right? I know some people say, well, he's working out the bugs with Adam and perfected with Eve. Yeah, that's one of the thoughts or theories. I get that. My thought, and I don't know that this is biblical, but I have a theory. God created Adam first and gave him a while because I think Adam needed to figure out that fellowship with God needed to come first before fellowship with a companion. That's my theory. Is that on some level, we in our lives need to understand that peace and happiness, and we need to find contentment in a relationship with God rather than seeking other relationships to fill that void in our life. And so, but other people, maybe it's not even a relationship, it's just sex or pornography or a variety of other things, just that's the drive, that consumes so many people. Think about Solomon. Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. That's crazy. It's all I can do with one, and she's awesome. But man, I can't imagine that. 700 wives. Now, some of those were political alliances that he developed over time. But there's a lot of people that are around for him all the time, and these concubines and women who basically spent all day just trying to look awesome for when Solomon called on her. And they call just to basically act out any of your desires, any of your fantasies. You've got women there for you. He had people that knew his taste and would find the most beautiful women in the world and bring them back to him. He had all that. And some people think that, and they don't necessarily, go and bring back concubines, although maybe that's, we call them prostitutes sometimes, but we create our own harems, with pornography. It's interesting. The pornography industry generates $13 billion a year in the United States. $13 billion. In fact, 1 in 8 searches online are for erotic content. And it comes at a price. 56% of divorce cases involve one party having an obsessive interest in pornographic websites. Over half of them. Solomon didn't need virtual women. He had the real deal. But even that, he said, it didn't satisfy. It didn't satisfy. I would say this. Actually, those who delve into pornography, it creates a desire for more pornography. It never satisfies a deeper desire. I know somebody that actually spent time in prison for raping a woman, and it started with pornography. And I said, what happened? He said, I did pornography, and it was always I wanted more and more and more and more, and eventually that's the path it led to. I'm not saying everywhere ends up that way. But he had everything, that pleasure could bring him, and that didn't satisfy him. Let's go on the next thing, the last one. Some people say, well, I'll be happy when I'm accomplished or admired. When I'm accomplished, when people respect me, when people appreciate what I've done. When I really accomplish something and I have admiration. Verse 9-11, he says, I became great and increased more than all who preceded me in Jerusalem. He said, my wisdom also stood by me. All that my eyes desired, I did not refuse them. I did not withhold my heart from any pleasure. For my heart was pleased because of all my labor, and this was my reward for all my labor. He did amazing things. He had the admiration of everybody, and people would come from all over,
just to listen to him or be close to him. And even that didn't satisfy him. And some people think if I could just accomplish enough in life to where I'm remembered or accomplished or admired, and that doesn't satisfy. Now, a lot of these things aren't bad in and of themselves when they're, fleshed out within God's parameters and God's plan. But at the same time, it says in Scripture, seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, then all these things will be added. And so many people seek after all these things and say, if I just had this, then I'd be happy, or feel discontent on some level because they feel like something is missing. And so we seek after all these different things. So what's the solution? I'm just going to say two things this morning, and this is super, super simple, but I think it's super, super biblical. I think the solution really, first thing, enjoy life, but never lose sight of what makes others happy. Enjoy life, but never lose sight of what makes others happy. Christians should enjoy life. We should, God wants us to be happy. But this idea that every one of my decisions is determined not by what might make somebody else happy, but what makes me happy, is a miserable way to do life. It's not satisfying, and it leaves a trail of wounded people around as we're self-absorbed with our own search for happiness. Does that make sense? When we say the most important thing is that I'm happy, man, we live in such a culture right now, and I think this is such a relevant thing these days where it's really just whatever makes you happy. Deny yourself nothing that you want. Don't suppress anything. And yet in Philippians chapter 2, Paul says, do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. It's not wrong to look to your own interest. It'd be lying to think that we could operate that way and not think of that. But when that's all we're focused on is our own happiness, we're going to leave a trail of wounded people around us. And it says, don't just look out for yourself, think of others as well. And I would say this, there is deep, deep happiness in putting others' needs above yourself at times. Now I get that going to the other extreme, trying to make everybody happy all the time can make you miserable. And so I get there's a balance. But there is something really gratifying. It's interesting, I've taken, youth groups and other people on mission trips to serve others. People come back and say, that was one of the best weeks of my life. And it really was a whole week that was devoted to somebody else rather than themselves. Because it was satisfying on some level. We're created that way. So we need to keep others in mind when it comes to happiness. The second one I think is even more important. Enjoy life, but never lose sight of what makes God happy. Never lose sight of what makes God happy. There is in danger of putting what makes us happy over what makes God happy. Because after all, God's a God of grace and God's a God of love, and he will love me no matter what. And he will always take me in, and if I do something wrong, he'll still forgive me. And so the problem is, and it's not just outside the church, but even within the church as Christians, there's too often we accept Jesus as our Savior, but we think that we can go through life still doing what makes us happy, even if it doesn't make God happy. Forgetting what Jesus said, if anyone may come after me, let him deny himself, pick up his cross and follow me. And we live in a culture that says, don't deny yourself anything. And anybody who tells you to deny yourself of something, they're just being judgmental and hurtful and hateful. And look what he says in Ecclesiastes chapter 11. He says, be happy. Oh, go ahead and put that. Do I have that up there? He said, be happy while you're young, and let your heart give you joy in the days of your youth. Follow the ways of your heart and whatever your eyes see, but know that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. I think it's interesting that he speaks specifically to young people, because I think sometimes when we're young, we're not always thinking about consequences. We're not thinking long term. I know that I didn't, and I still struggle with that at times, but it's just really, and particularly we have when you're younger and the culture that we live in is really about just be happy, and pursue that. But he says, you know what, while you're young, do whatever you want, have fun. Oh, by the way, the only thing I would say is this. Know that after all these things, God will bring you into judgment. So you go crazy, you do anything you want. But if you think that there's not going to be a level of accountability for those things, or you're not going to have to
give an answer for things, he said, you're fooling yourself. So go crazy, have fun. But at the same time, you might want to keep in mind that at some point you have to give an account of yourself to God. Think about that as we make our decisions. It says Proverbs 16:2, we can always prove we're right, but will God be convinced? At some point, you stand before the Lord. Let me add this. I think sin has natural consequences that come as a result of our actions. But sometimes there are God-imposed consequences, that he will hold us accountable. I want to close with just one other verse from Solomon. He said, go ahead, do I have that? Let's read this together. Ready? To the person who pleases him, God gives wisdom, knowledge, and what? Happiness. To the person who pleases God, God will please him. God will give him wisdom, knowledge, happiness. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. Make God happy, and you'll be amazed at how much happier you in life. But go through life putting yourself on the throne, it's not going to satisfy. And so I want to encourage us this morning, and we may not go all out in all of these areas like Solomon, but there are times in our life where it's a battle of the will of who's going to be Lord of our life. Who do I want to be most happy? Is it me that I'm serving and I want to be happy? Or if I'm at a crossroads, do I say, what would God make most happy? What do you think would happen if before every one of our decisions we said, what would make God most happy? It would change things, wouldn't it? What if our world made a decision and said, what would make God most happy? Regardless of what I think or what I feel, what would make God most happy? The world would look a lot different, wouldn't it? We're not going to be perfect about it, and I want to sing this song as we close. I invite you to stand this morning, and we can go ahead and, turn that off.